Let's get talking taboo.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Taboo. My name is Paul Schultz.
I'm Meredith Sloan.
And I'm Tej Joshi.
And we have two beautiful guests with us today. Please feel free to introduce yourselves.
All right, so my name is Anthony Sis. I am the Assistant Director for the LGBTQ Student Center here at the University of Miami.
I'm Brenna Monroe, and I'm a professor in the English department, and I also teach for the Women and Gender Studies program.
So you're probably wondering why we're all here, and we're here to talk transgender rights. We're here to talk about people who are transage, transabled. But first, I guess we'll start with the basics. What does it mean to be transgender?
I mean, I think from a very kind of simple definition standpoint, it's basically anybody who's outside of the binary of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And so I think a lot of times people kind of associate being transgender with a particular visual around transition, physical transition, but being transgender can also be so much more. And so there's a spectrum of different transgender identities. And so really, I think the simple definition is anyone who doesn't identify as a man or a woman and kind of identifies along this spectrum of other identities as someone who's transgender.
And one question I always have is, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? What does it feel to be like a man or a woman? Because at the end of the day, I feel as though I am a boy, and I don't think I truly know what that means because I haven't known otherwise. So if you want to break it down to our listeners, what do you personally think it means to be a man or a woman? It's a juicy question, so take your time.
Juicy.
Well, I might just add to Anthony's definition of transgender that, you know, it's anyone whose gender identity doesn't match the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. So, I mean, that brings up the question of identity and identification, which I think you're getting at. Like, what's it? How do you...
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's sort of an impossible question to answer because it's so personal, right? Like, how would you answer it?
Right. I took a women and gender studies class once, and in that class, I asked the teacher, how do you know you're a woman, and how do you know you feel like a woman? And so I asked her, is it because you're comfortable with your biological sex, then you can confirm that you're a woman? Or if she had been born with male parts, would she conform to that? So I guess the question I was always striving to, is it your sex first and whether you're comfortable with your sex that then allows you to be comfortable with a male or female identity? Or is it something more inherent and innate that is not contingent to physiological parts?
Well, I think oftentimes when we think about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a boy and girl, it's often kind of societal norms and expectations of what it means to be a man or a boy or a girl or a woman. And so oftentimes I think we use these kind of traditional notions that are really like heteronormative, so really focus on this kind of hetero dynamic of like man and woman being together as opposed to two men being together, two women being together, or a trans person and somebody who identifies as cisgender, which is somebody who identifies with their sex assigned at birth, right? And so, so there's so many different things that I think oftentimes I just think about kind of norms and expectations around what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and I think oftentimes trans folks, which there are a lot more trans folks than people actually think, transgender folks in particular, and so because they don't necessarily conform to the societal expectations and norms of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And so I think just kind of I think particularly now too with just society and with the media and everything around exposure to transgender folks, I think there's kind of this opening in the sense of kind of understanding that transgender identity is so much more than just kind of the transition piece, or, you know, it's so much more than that. And so, I mean, yeah, it's a very rich conversation. It's a very rich identity.
We got an hour. Right, this conversation.
I mean,
yes.
I would just add that, you know, I don't think it's like a one-time thing. Like, oh, am I a woman? You know, that we kind of gain our gender identities over the course of childhood. And so it's not about knowing that you have a sexed body, it's about responding to all of the cues that you're being given by everyone else around you as you grow. And people's responses to those cues, whether they sort of say, oh, you know, when you're given a girl name, your nursery is pink, you are put in the girls' classroom at kindergarten. You know, you're classified by everyone else in terms of gender all the time. And so some people might respond to that by being like, and this is not a sort of like a thing that you remember, right? Because it starts before your conscious memories do, that you're like, but presumably it's like, oh yes, I am a girl. I answer to the name Brenna, you know, and then that becomes a part of who you are and how you understand yourselves. So it's the same process, whether you're cisgender or genderqueer or transgender. It's just that you go in a slightly different direction, right? You sort of agree or disagree with what everyone else is kind of telling you that you are.
Right.
But your internal feeling of, I'm a woman, that's what I am, is the same, whatever your gender identity is.
Are there any instances of maybe parents who have a child and at birth they identify the gender as genderqueer and not necessarily one of like, you know, like a normative like man or woman gender, and then like you said, being transgender is anyone who believes their gender is different than what they were assigned at birth. So are there, I'm just trying to, maybe like there's like some circumstances out there where anyone's been assigned at birth by their family and society around them, like maybe in a smaller group, as, you know,
like the family lets them choose what their
no, not
gender
even let them
is.
choose, but the family imposes on them like being
The
non-binary. Like, you think, like, does that happen?
I mean, there's definitely, I've read about families, I feel like it was Sweden, but now I can't remember, where they've sort of made a decision to raise their child without sort of imposing a gender on them, which I think is a little bit different
That
from
is
saying
difficult,
you're genderqueer.
though. So before we continue, does anyone want to define non-binary?
So non-binary is anybody who basically fits outside the binary of being a man and being a woman. And so I think folks who identify as non-binary, myself included, actually, you know, we kind of, for me personally, you know, there was a certain point in my identity development where I realized I don't really feel comfortable identifying as a man, and I don't really feel comfortable identifying as a woman, and I kind of feel comfortable identifying somewhere in between or outside of those margins of what it means to be a man and a woman based off of society's expectations. So anybody who's non-binary kind of fits into that framework of being outside the binary.
But would you say that maybe that like no one is necessarily binary, no one is man or woman, and everyone really is somewhere on this non-binary scale, and just the people who are identifying like that just happen to be more educated and aware of just like different things about how gender and and just about gender itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, but then I also do feel like dependent on kind of upbringing and culture and other elements, right, of what it takes when you grow up or what you're exposed to when you grow up, that some people really do feel like they're part of the binary of being a man and being a woman. And so I think it's also important to, I think traditionally speaking, it's always been named as kind of the norm, but that's the reason why cisgender became a terminology, right? Because to identify it as a separate identity as opposed to saying, oh, that's the norm identity. That's the normal, but it's really not normal, right? Like there's so many other people who actually fit outside of the binary, so it's important to also name the fact that the norm also has an identity and it's not the norm.
So in your experience, you say you identify as non-binary. Which bathroom do you use? Just out of curiosity. I know on campus here at UM we have gender neutral bathrooms, we have men's, we have women's. Which bathroom do you personally use?
I think for me personally, I always like to use the gender inclusive bathrooms just because it's indicative of, everyone has to use the bathroom regardless of your gender identity, right? And so I think particularly in those spaces, it definitely feels more comfortable to go to a gender inclusive restroom. But if, in the event that there is a gendered restroom, I typically go towards the men's restroom simply because of my presentation, right? So, I present as very masculine. I present myself as, very much kind of subscribing to kind of
the
male
stereotype,
identity, the stereotype or the mold, right, of like what it means to be a man. And so typically, in gendered spaces, I'll have to choose. But what I do think it's important to mention, though, is that a lot of folks don't have that privilege to be able to kind of, choose one over the other based off of their presentation. And so I think that's the reason why it's important to have gender inclusive restrooms on campuses or in different spaces, just because some folks really, there's a safety risk to that, right? In terms of presentation and in terms of how people may perceive their gender identity in order to simply just use the restroom, even though we all use the restroom for essentially the same purpose.
So if you're comfortable with it, what exactly about male and female identities do you feel like you least associate with? that makes you consider yourself non-binary? Like, what bits and pieces of both or the entirety of both make you understand, you know what, I don't fit into these two molds, I'm non-binary?
I think it's a very complex question to answer.
Right.
I think for me personally, I think I just don't. I've never really liked the limitations subscribed to either identities, and so I want to be able to feel liberated to say some days I'll wake up very feminine, and then I'll wake up some days and feel very masculine, right? And so that's okay. And so I think that's like the kind of general kind of concept of kind of how I describe my identity.
So a typical argument, I guess, going off of that is, as a man, do you feel like if you were allowed the opportunity to be effeminate, that you would still deem yourself non-binary? Would that make a difference? Does that make sense?
Like, are you saying that if our societal idea of what a man is was like different, or maybe more inclusive than maybe
femininity and masculinity?
Yeah, then like some people who identify as non-binary may not do that anymore. Is that what you're getting at?
Right. Does that make sense? So, for example, if someone identifies as non-binary, but what a male encompasses, or what a male's identity encompasses, also entails feminine attributes or like effeminate traits, do you feel like then that would be more inclusive of what you would want to identify with? Or if being a woman was more than just being the stereotypes and it also included stereotypically masculine activities, do you feel like people would still necessarily need to identify as non-binary if both of those fields were made more inclusive of more attributes?
I think it's more of a personal thing. So, I think there are definitely folks who maybe identify as a man who think that, being a man also embodies feminine characteristics or traits and things like that. So I think it's very much a personal thing in terms of just how folks feel comfortable identifying as, right? And so I've, definitely met folks who, are also non-binary, similar to me, who very much present themselves as masculine, even though they were born male, right? And so but they identify as non-binary. So I think that's what... I think for me, when I think about just transgender identity, we really have to kind of open up that conversation that it's okay to be transgender and it's okay to be part of the spectrum, because sometimes or oftentimes, right, being a man, being a woman embodies such strict kind of characteristics and norms and attitudes and behaviors that folks just simply don't subscribe to, right? And so I think there are a lot more trans folks than people actually think, and that's okay. And so I don't necessarily think that the openness or kind of incorporation of more inclusion in terms of what it means to be a man or woman will kind of enrichen, or you know what I'm saying? I don't know if it'll necessarily make a difference. I think there will still be trans folks regardless, and I think there will still be folks who identify as non-binary, genderqueer, transgender man, transgender woman. So I think there's always going to be those separate identities regardless of the inclusion.
So what pronoun do you prefer since you do identify as non-binary? Do you have a preference? If people call you he, is that offensive?
No, and that's for a number of reasons, but I do use they, them, their pronouns, and I'm very explicit in that. And so in my kind of approach with folks, I didn't say it in my introductions today, but I do use they, them, their pronouns, and that's just a personal thing. I know there are trans folks who don't use they, them, they use he, him, or she, her, and so, and that's okay too. So, yeah.
What question I have, or I guess a statement I have, is that it almost seems that society kind of pits anyone that isn't heteronormative or straight into one category. So that'll transition us into the next conversation, which has to do with transage and transabled people. And it almost seems that there are minorities within the LGBTQ community that want to adopt these labels. And so I'll go ahead and say or describe what transage means. So transage is basically someone who feels as though they are another age as opposed to the one that they are now physically. And I'll leave that up to discussion. But for me personally, age at the end of the day is physiological. And I feel like when you age, you are aging physically. And age is pretty much subjective to everyone. Some people are more mature, some people have more experiences. So what do you guys think it means for someone to feel another age, or to feel a younger age at that?
I mean, I think that people probably have pretty varied subjective relationships to their chronological age. But I have to say that I don't feel like you know, when I Google Transage, what I get are a lot of media stories about one very problematic person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then some articles by right-wing publications that are clearly designed to kind of, you know,
belittle,
delegitimize trans people by bringing up these new identities that most people think are either non-existent or indicate some kind of mental illness, right? And I mean, I don't want to say, you know, make any kind of pronouncements about that potential identity form because there's no research on it, right? And perhaps more importantly, there isn't a large body of work from a subculture that uses that name to describe themselves and talks about themselves, right? So, I mean, if you compare the emergence of these conversations about age, disability, and race through the trans lens with when intersex people stepped up in the 90s and were like, we exist, we want to use this word to talk about ourselves, we'd like to change the way that doctors treat us. This is a really different thing that's happening right now, where it's instead we have these people who are being talked about, right, by the media, rather than, you know, like
a community forming an agreement to yes, I feel this way.
Yeah. So I sort of feel like I don't want to kind of dismiss that identity formation because who am I to do that? But I also don't think that we can talk with any confidence about it yet because
there is backing up to it.
I think people are really quick to jump and say that Transage is mental health. It's all mental health related because one of the cases we were looking at before the show involved a dad who he had 7 children and a wife of 23 years, and then all of a sudden he decides he wants to be a 6-year-old female, and he goes off and like finds an adopted family, and the way the article was twisted, kind of the way that bogus. They're like, here's this guy with all these responsibilities. They made it seem like a cop-out. So then I think people are quick to point out, is Transage real? Is it mental health? Is it something else? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, you know, with the whole transage and transracial talk and kind of how it fits into this trans framework, I think, you know, when you look at the research, you look at the statistics for the transgender community, I mean, there's a multitude of different numbers and multitude of different studies that kind of showcase, all pointing really to the problem of kind of erasure of trans folks. And so with Transage, with all these other trans identities, similarly, right, you know, who am I to say that these identities don't exist? But I think the real conversation with trans identity should really be around just how do we elevate the voices of the transgender community that have been at the forefront of even the gay liberation movement since the 60s, right? When you have Marsha P. Johnson, who was part of the Stonewall riots, and then there was the film about Stonewall that completely whitewashed that whole history and that narrative around how queer folks of color, particularly trans folks of color, were involved in kind of on the onset and the initiative for the gay liberation movement here in the U.S. And so I think really centering the lives and the voices of the transgender community is really important. But when we talk about all these other identities and its intersections with transgender identity, it kind of gets murky and gets lost and really contributes to the erasure piece that's been such a problem for the transgender community.
I think a major thing to look at, though, with transageism, or transage, I'm not sure exactly what the right term is, even it's that like, I think it's that little talked about as a thing. I'm not even sure exactly
what the noun for it would be.
Exactly. Right. But I think it's really important to look at anyone who's identifying as trans, anyone if they're new, like the age they're identifying with now is like below the age of a minor. Because I think that like creates a lot of just like different like interesting like dynamics in our society where like now are they renouncing their rights to vote and like other
like able to attend school again with minors.
It's like it's a very because like I obviously like you guys all have also I don't want to be like, oh, this person is crazy and they shouldn't be able to feel this way about themselves, but I think there's a lot of things ethics, that can happen and other ethical things around people around that person that you're not sure exactly how you want to take moving forward. You know, I'm not sure if I'm fully making sense.
No, for sure. I think that brings up an important point. And I think we can tie that to transgender rights and transgender like bathroom usage. For people that feel uncomfortable with transgender people entering their bathroom because they might not physically present in a way that's appropriate to that bathroom, what do you say to that? How do you feel about that?
Well, it's even the same argument, right? Like exactly what you're saying. Like what some people are saying, like why transgender people shouldn't use the bathrooms they identify with, is the same thing I feel like I'm sort of saying about
there's like a
trans
parallel
age
between
people, but I don't want that parallel to be drawn because I feel like it's different because of what you were saying about
the lack of research.
Well, this is kind of my point, really.
Yeah.
Is that, so, I mean, if you look at this in a historical context, right? Whenever there's a sort of shift in people's kind of, norms around a group that has previously been stigmatized, there's usually a repolicing of the boundaries, right? And usually some kind of backlash. So, like in the 70s, when the APA eliminated homosexuality as a
mental disorder, I was just about to bring that up.
They actually introduced the gender identity disorder, right? So there's a sort of like, okay, we're going to designate this group as okay, and we're going to designate a new group as kind of like the problem, whatever. And the 2013 DSM changed the way, based on the consensus of psychiatrists that being transgender was understood as no longer being a disorder in and of itself, but that the distress associated with not having your gender match your assigned sex in our society, if people were experiencing that distress, which not all trans people do, then that's the thing that needs treatment, right? So, I mean, we're at a moment of kind of definition change, right, and boundary changing. And so it's just at that moment that you suddenly get all these sensationalist news stories about Rachel Dolezal and all that kind of thing.
We talked about her last week, actually.
And you also get, all of these bathroom laws being introduced, which kind of are based on the specter of the kind of sex predator, transgender person, which is precisely the story that these articles about this
are trying to make of these people who...
Absolutely.
They're trying to draw the parallel to transgender people and using bathrooms and locker rooms that they identify with, when I don't think that parallel exists. But maybe I'm wrong, maybe it does, but I just don't think we're at a place where we can definitively say either way.
Right.
I think that the goal of those stories about this transage man is to make people more scared of transgender people.
Absolutely.
Because and in a way you can see the ghost of homophobia there too, because gay men have been associated homophobically
to pedophilia as well.
So it's kind of the same story changing shape and producing different kind of targets.
Right. I really like the fact that you mentioned that with this new introduction of different types of people, there should be a repolicing of ethics and rules, because that's so true in terms of transgender rights. I know, I feel her name is Jazz Jennings.
Yes.
At her age,
she's the teenager
who transitioned, and at her age, she's already bringing up conversations about trans rights and who can use which bathrooms. I know she had a debate with Tommy Lauren, and she's only 13. Tommy's 26, 27. And I think it's those types of conversations that are important, but at the same time, I also feel like there's a lack of conversation and almost like a mindless acceptance of people who are trans age and transabled. And although I'm not arguing that we shouldn't accept people, I just feel like there should always be a conversation alongside any form of acceptance. I saw a tweet the other day of someone claiming that trans age was now officially part of the LGBTQ community. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that it's almost like straight people are one category and then everyone else is another. And then they just get bunched up with the LGBTQ community. And who am I to say whether it should be in that category or not? But before ever really taking in a label, I feel like it's so important to discuss the ethics behind it, because it's so, like you said, under-researched. But in terms of trans and trans culture, we're going to go into people who are transabled. I don't know if you want to go ahead and introduce that.
So basically, transabled people, the definition here, I have it right in front of me. A physical disability is a limitation on one person's physical functioning, mobility, dexterity, and stamina. So these can include things that are like respiratory disorders, blindness, epilepsy, sleep disorders, and the key is that they're self-inflicted. So these people think that they should live their life having whatever disability it is they feel would be right in their body. So what do you think about that? Is it real?
I mean, like I said earlier, I've never. This is actually the first time I had heard of transabled, right? Yeah. And so I think for me, I just, I'm just like, how do we, through these narratives and through these particular identities, how do we still, focus on the trans experience, particularly here in the U.S. and particularly globally? And I don't think we're at a point where we can even think about transgender identity is something beyond like male and female, and so it's an ongoing conversation. And I'm sure maybe there is room, right, as you were saying with the tweet around like Transage, but I still keep thinking to myself, around Transable and the lack of research behind it, right, thus far, right. And so just I don't know, I just I just never heard of it before, so it's a learning lesson for me, and so it's So I just still keep thinking about, though, how do we go back to centering the lives of, how do we go to centering the transgender experience here, particularly because we have so many laws that are based off of transphobia and homophobia and just general assumptions around gender and gender performance, and also still be mindful of other trans identities. Right. But I think for me, it goes back to like just kind of that whole erasure piece. For me.
It's interesting because transability is also known as body integrity identity disorder, and I feel like if it were introduced that way, no one would relate it to the trans community at all, because I feel like the only reason it's being grouped with transgenderism is because of the trans pronoun in it. But body integrity identity disorder is in the appendix section of the DSM-5, the 2013 version, which is probably outdated, much outdated by now, I'm assuming.
I don't think so. I think 2013.
Or is that a pretty recent? Yeah. Well, so it's in there, and if it's in there, then I'm assuming it could be a pretty legitimate identity. But I think the inherent issue is grouping that with transgenderism and assuming that they're one and the same when they're completely different, and when like LGBTQ communities are grouped one and the same, when like a lesbian experience is so much different than a gay experience, or bisexual experience, a pansexual experience. But it's that sense of heteronormativity that groups anything different from that together, which is ultimately the issue.
And there's always conversation too around the term LGBTQ, right? And how oftentimes it's really, when folks say LGBTQ in some spaces, that really just means LG and not B, because there isn't a lot of conversation around bisexual identity and much less about transgender identity, right? And so I think oftentimes too, even within the community, there is this kind of sense of division,
more valid than
right? Which one's more valid and which one gets heard more, and definitely the T definitely does get, historically speaking, get put by the wayside, right? And so I think particularly in just my own personal identity and just in the work that I do too, I always try to be conscious of kind of whose voices are being heard and whose voices are not being heard in certain spaces. And for those voices that aren't necessarily being heard in certain spaces, how do I elevate those voices? Or how do I elevate, the bisexual identity voice if folks in a particular space that's focused on LGBTQ identity work is not necessarily being addressed in that space, right? Even though I personally don't identify as bisexual, but how am I still empowering and elevating those voices, even though they're not being heard? Or maybe there are folks in that space who are questioning, maybe resonate with a particular identity along the LGBTQ spectrum, but just kind of making sure that there's still some sort of exposure and there's still some sort of sense of empowerment for folks who may be a part of those identities.
So from an outside view, I see non-binary and bisexual as, for someone who's not very knowledgeable on either, as almost kind of having similarities. Can you explain the difference between them? Because clearly they're two separate identities.
Yeah, well, so non-binary has to do mostly with gender identity, and bisexual has to do with sexual orientation. And so I think, there's even conversation around the difference between transgender and transsexual, which oftentimes I think people will kind of use them interchangeably. And so I think it's always important to look at it from context around which culture is using it. And so when we look at a Western context, right, transsexual is more of an outdated term, and so the more accepted terminology is transgender. But in some countries or in some other region, some folks may say transsexual, and it may be more culturally accepted.
But why is that? Why in our society have we moved away from transsexual? And when that was the more common term, what exactly did that mean?
I was assuming that transsexual now meant post-surgery.
That's what I
And
thought as
transgender
well.
was the identity.
Well, I've also heard that transsexual, like it's not like politically correct to say it anymore.
Right.
But I'm just not understanding exactly why we moved to transgender.
I think it's history, evolution of language. And so I think particularly one good example I can think of is the word queer, right? And so if you talk to the older generation, say 2-3 generations ago around the term queer, it was a very derogatory and offensive term. But ever since the 90s with academia and research around queer theory, there's kind of reappropriation of that terminology as something more encompassing of LGBTQ identity. So I think part of it is just the evolution of history and language being a key part, right? Because I think particularly in Spanish, for somebody myself who speaks Spanish, who grew up speaking Spanish, to say gay, really a more common way to say it is homosexual, which the literal translation in English is homosexual. But homosexual is a much more scientific terminology. It's not really kind of culturally appropriate in English to say homosexual. It's more common to say gay. But in Spanish, it's more common to say homosexual. So I think part of it's just the evolution of language, evolution of history in particular areas. And so it's just something to keep in mind as we think about another layer of kind of something to keep in mind when we think about LGBTQ.
But not
identities.
worrying about the connotations, you're looking at the literal meanings. Was there a difference even when they were like one was popular and in the
Were
past?
they ever used at the same time
Yeah.
for two different reasons?
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. Do they mean
Different things.
Yeah.
Transgender is a wider term.
Okay.
Yeah.
So transsexual implies, as I understand it, that you identify as the quote-unquote opposite, although that's obviously a problematic way of understanding gender, but gender to the one that you were assigned.
In a binary sense, is opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a person who's transsexual may or may not. But that's the thing. I think that part of the reason why the word has become a bit problematic is because it is so deeply associated in people's imaginations with like surgery and that people are sort of fixated on that anyway, right? So I also know that there are people who proudly use that term to describe themselves, right? So it's definitely a contested word.
One thing I want to point out, you mentioned queer theory. So does queer, by definition, only relate to sexuality, or does it also relate to gender identity? Or is it just an umbrella term for anything?
Depends who's using it.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say.
Good answer.
Because if it's queer theory, then it almost seems a little, I guess, problematic for gender identities and sexualities to be discussed under it, because they're such different things that there should almost be a word for a study of either. Does it make sense?
They speak to each other though, right? And so I think gender informs sexual orientation and vice versa, right? And so I don't think there's differences, yes, in terms of identities and kind of understandings of gender and sexuality, but they also inform, one's gender informs how one's sexual orientation is and vice versa. So they inform each other in many ways. Okay. And so I think in order to have a really complex conversation around gender, you also have to have a complex and enriched conversation around sexual orientation and understanding that the two, transgender is a perfect example, right? So a lot of times people assume that transgender folks are gay or are lesbian or whatever. But oftentimes, because transgender is solely focused on gender, it may not have to do anything with their sexual orientation. Right. And so I think there's that assumption almost always around folks who say, oh, well, if you're transgender, it's because you're gay. Or it's like, no.
I think
if you're transgender, you're just transgender.
Like that's a common mistake, at least my family does. They think that anyone that is transgender or lesbian or anything that isn't straight is just gay. They'll use the word gay for everything. Gay will be synonymous for everything that isn't straight.
Yeah.
One question I have for both of you, have you had any uncomfortable experiences or interactions for you, for example, regarding being non-binary, or maybe having to explain it to someone who doesn't get it, and maybe having the conversation not go the way you wanted? Any bad experiences?
All the time. I think it's always a challenging conversation because you just never know. I think especially for myself being non-binary, it's always a matter of safety, and it's always a matter of who can you fully disclose this non-binary identity to and yet still feel safe in a particular space. And so I think safety and space are always the key things, and I think particularly for the transgender community, that's kind of a common narrative that you'll hear among folks who identify in some way, shape, or form with the trans community is around safety, around issues of security, around issues of feeling marginalized even further. And I think when you look at the research, right, you think about discrimination, you think about housing, you think about poverty, you think about substance abuse and all these other elements. And for trans folks, especially if they're trans folks of color, you know, trans women of color in particular, Black and Latina women in particular, Black trans women are disproportionately being murdered for simply just being trans. And so I think that's a reality that a lot of folks face, particularly the trans community. And so I think that's the reason why it's important to not just solely focus on gender identity and sexual orientation, but also the plethora of different identities that we carry, right? And so, and how those can compound or even enhance or lift, what am I trying to say? Can essentially heighten kind of the safety and security of simply living as a trans person. And so, so all the time, I think I go through a couple of experiences all the time. And I think I have the pleasure at least to be able to do educational work around what it means to be trans and talk about my own experience. But a lot of people don't have that privilege to be able to do so, to be able to talk about their experience in a safe environment. Right. And so I think for me, I always just think about kind of the safety and the disproportionate amount of violence affecting Black trans women in particular and brown trans women for just being themselves.
Right. And I think it's so important for you both to realize that even though you may not see it now, in the future, you will technically have been trailblazers for this type of education. So definitely a pat on the shoulder for you both.
Oh,
because
thank you.
It's people like you that do allow for a more accepting future. It's people who are educated like you guys that allow for this type of environment, for this to be aired, you know, around Coral Gables. And people are listening. We actually just got a question. Someone said, "Hi guys, I'd love to hear more about the struggles in dating as a transgender male or female. In specific, could you talk about someone trying to date the same birth sex and the struggles that come with that? Stigma amongst the people they are attracted to, trying to be honest while also not trying to scare people away." So I know neither of you are transgender.
Loaded question.
But maybe we can dive into what it's like to date as a transgender individual and maybe the fear that comes behind that, especially like you mentioned, sometimes in the gay community there is still discrimination even amongst our minority groups.
I just personally think like it's not the responsibility of the person who's trans to disclose their identity unless they feel comfortable doing so, right? And so I think particularly in the folks that I know who are trans and even for myself in terms of my non-binary identity, like I don't feel the need to disclose that identity unless I feel comfortable with that particular individual that I'm seeing or that I'm talking to. And so I think there's often, and that's also the reason why the violence happens in the trans community is because it'll be some sort of situation where they don't disclose their identity, and then when they do, they often get, or not often, but in some situations, right, unfortunate situations, they'll be murdered for disclosing that identity, right? And so, or maybe not disclosing it and then, having to encounter violence as a result of it. So it's just, I just feel like, I think when it comes to just trans identity, like, disclosure is up to the individual who identifies as part of that community. And so if you find out at a later date that the person is trans, I don't think you should take offense to it. That's their personal decision. And if you really respect and care for that person, then you will not let that impact kind of your relationship with them.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was just thinking about this very beloved friend of mine who transitioned 10 years ago or something like that. And at the time we had this conversation about, is dating going to be tricky? But actually it hasn't been at all, right? And I think that that's because he is kind of immersed in a queer social world in which disclosure is almost not even a thing because it's a world in which that sort of thing is okay, you know what I mean? So I think it's also really, you're absolutely right that trans people who are navigating the straight dating world, that is an extremely dangerous world, right? Because it's not one that's hospitable to, right. That's challenges to heteronormativity fundamentally. But it is also true that trans people have love and sex and happiness, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to be also remembered. Mm-hmm.
So my question for you, Professor Monroe, is that you actually wrote a book recently called South Africa and the Dream of Love to Come, all about queer sexuality and the struggle for freedom. So can you speak to what it would be like as a South African person who is trans? What is that dating scene like?
And also, where can you purchase your book?
Well, it's actually
advertise yourself.
In a while now, but I don't know that there's one answer to that question. Mm-hmm. South Africa is a very complicated, diverse country.
Why South Africa?
You mean why did I write about South Africa?
Yes.
Well, because I was really inspired by their post-apartheid constitution. In 1996, after apartheid ended, they rewrote their constitution in an unusually kind of participatory process, unlike the US Constitution, for example.
Donald Trump.
So it was the first country in the world to include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation constitutionally. So it has great laws in that way, and it has some amazing queer communities. But probably what you've heard about South Africa is that it's also very that there are a lot of people who faced violence there, and that's definitely the case. That there's been a lot of murders and sexual violence, and so it's complicated.
I felt that in my experience, I was in South Africa recently. I felt that it was almost the opposite of the US, where they were more accepting of sexuality and less accepting of racial differences. I felt that, black and white were separate, and I felt that the white areas were more affluent, and then right across, I noticed the black areas were much more poor and run down. So why do you think, even though it was post-apartheid, after all that oppression kind of crumbled, why do you think that they kind of jumped on being more open to sexuality?
I think it's partly because during apartheid there was so much there was so much kind of policing of sexuality because of all the laws against interracial sex and marriage. And so there was this kind of moment when people were getting rid of apartheid where they were like, we want none of that, right? We want to be free, and that's going to include everyone. So it's actually kind of fascinating because there was they've done the kind of studies, and the majority of people in South Africa think that homosexuality is wrong. But for this kind of one moment, they were like, but they should have rights, So that's kind of how that happened, and also because there were anti-apartheid activists who were gay who came out and kind of argued with their political colleagues about that issue, and so the ANC, which was the party that won the elections after apartheid and fought apartheid, they were on the side of gay rights, right? And that was partly because of these gay anti-apartheid activists.
Now, before we continue, I just wanted to give everyone our phone number. You can call or text in and ask any questions. It's 786-309-8861. That's 786-309-8861.
I just wanted to add another piece to the dating comment, right, in terms of also knowing that there can be hostility not just in navigating the straight world as a trans person, but also in navigating the queer world as a trans person, right? And so, gay folks and LGBTQ folks in general can still identify as cisgender. And so I also think that there are kind of certain assumptions around masculinity and femininity and how they're performed even in queer spaces. And so even navigating even navigating those spaces in terms of dating or just intimacy as a trans person can also be extremely complicated. And I think that's been more of my experience is, folks saying, oh, well, I want to date someone who's masculine. And I'm just like, well,
mask for mask.
Right. And I'm just like,
the devil is real.
Mask for tacos any day, all day. Right. And so I think for me, it's just, it's just kind of this masculinity is such a performance and femininity is such a performance that I, enjoy reveling in both, but there are some folks even within queer spaces who are very strict. And I think particularly because I'm from Chicago, and so even navigating spaces here in Miami, that's been my experience, is very cisgender, very strictly like, okay, I'm gay, but I'm only seeking masculine folks. And I'm like, okay, well, you may get that on some days, but not all days, right? So I think there's also, even as a trans person, challenges in navigating queer spaces as well.
Do you feel like, you said you're a native Spanish speaker, do you feel like they're more accepting, less accepting in the Spanish community when you incorporate that LGBTQ type of identity?
I think it's evolving in the Latino community. So my dad's from Guatemala, my mom's from Puerto Rico, and so I think there are definitely elements of that I see in both countries, in particular, right, around acceptance of LGBTQ identity. I definitely, there are still the isolated incidents that also, are as a result of just globally kind of perceptions of trans folks. But yeah, I think overall, I think there's pros and cons to both, right? And so when I first came out, it definitely wasn't the smoothest transition necessarily, and I think part of that played as a result of just the culture that both my parents grew up in. But now it's definitely changed. Now it's definitely a lot more positive. So I think it's just constantly evolving. But yeah, I think it just depends. Yeah.
Right.
So go ahead, Paul.
One question I wanted to ask every single person in the room. So I know ever since I was a young lad, I've always kind of tried to hide my femininity. And so I want to ask each one of you, do you feel like you've ever been very conscientious of how masculine or effeminate you are?
Absolutely.
Yeah, actually, something I really notice about myself is depending on what situation I'm in, like with a group of people in a certain room, or even if I'm like the leader of the room, or if like I'm leading a group of people, or if I'm not, I don't know if this is a direct correspondence with masculinity and like femininity, but like my pitch of my voice changes very heavily.
You'll lower it
like,
if you're
I'm
leading
not
a room?
consciously at all, but like I just noticed like my pitch changes. Like I don't like the people I see like hang out with in my regular life. I feel like it doesn't change as much for them, but like I feel like my like pitch changes all the time, up and down. Like no matter like I mean, and I haven't been able to find an exact correlation when it'd be low, but I think I've always noticed that about myself.
Right.
And I don't know if other people notice that about themselves.
I think I definitely do that, and I know ever since I was young, I've always
So
just
you do
tried.
it consciously?
I used to, and now I do it almost habitually. And
Okay.
so, like, if I'm around straight, very masculine guys, like, I'll start talking like that. And, like, I'll tone it down for the brothers or whatever. But I'm also very self-conscious about how I walk. And so I remember in middle school, I'd walk like a queen. And so, like, I would try to tone it down a little. And so now sometimes I catch myself walking in a very stereotypically masculine way. But I always wonder, had I not done that, how would I walk now? So are there parts of you that you feel like you've altered?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible not to in our culture.
I agree.
Right.
Especially as a female, I'm sure you can speak to this too. I think whenever I come across as a very feminine girl, I look very feminine, I feel like I act very feminine, but I'm also very assertive and I like to lead. I like to be the leader of a group. So I think when I'm approaching people, I sometimes have this really happy, high-pitched voice. But then if I'm trying to lead a group, I'm going to be assertive. I'm going to lower, same as what you're saying. I'm going to lower my pitch. I'm going to sound serious because I want to be taken seriously. So I think that my masculine energy definitely comes out when I'm trying to be more assertive.
But it's really interesting the ways that, like, even the examples we're giving that we use to, like, exemplify changes in our, like, behavior. Like, everyone here is talking about their walk and the way they talk. And these are always, like, very, like, things that are part of, like, make who you are, but are also, so, like, they're, like, things you don't really think about that much. Like, like, outside of, like, this, like, little circle right now, I don't think I would have thought about the pitch of my voice this week. Maybe the next 2 weeks, the next 3 weeks. Like,
I feel like I think about it often. Do
Really?
you feel that way?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's fascinating about gender performance is it's this confusing mixture of unconscious and deliberate, right? So, it's very hard in between that to figure out, like, why am I this way? Like, I'm crossing my legs in a way that I am not thinking about in advance, but I know it's exactly how my mother does it. So I clearly copied her, early on, but then at other times I'll be like, oh, I don't like my hair like this. I'll change it to make it look more whatever, So all of us, I think, go back and forth between habit and, like a deliberate performance.
Thank you both for being here. I don't want to gender either of you, so thank you both for
I'm
being
a big
here.
fan of degenderizing the word guys, 'cause I use it so casually. I don't like.
Yeah.
I think, but I don't know that.
Maybe next time we can talk about it.
I say y'all.
Wouldn't
So
say y'all, though, would you?
I don't think I would.
You wouldn't. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm Paul Schultz,
I'm Meredith Sloan.
I'm Tage Joshi.
and this is Talking Taboo. We'll catch you next week.